In her essay, Choreographies of Protest, then scholar Susan Foster proposed that we envision the body as capable of both persuasion and obstinate recalcitrance, demonstrating, as she puts it, the central role that physicality plays in constructing both individual agency and sociality. To prove her point, in the article, Foster examined 3 nonviolent demonstrations in which protesting bodies take center stage, executing pre-established plans in order to implement and set off representational strategies. And those strategies amount to choreographies of protest. So departing from Foster's approach on the body as capable of articulating disruptions and disseminating them through choreographed strategies. In this lecture performance, I take a look at the social-political significance of choreographed actions within body politics in Brazil. Combining dance and post-colonial studies, I'll consider 3 distinct cases where precarious bodies adopt risk-taking methods or procedures as a way of articulating non-hegemonic ideas corporeally and producing knowledges otherwise. Okay, here we go. First, I take a look at the Afro-Brazilian fight game known as Capoeira Angola, where moving bodies take alternating, improvising call and response dialogues grounded on a particular way of moving, which I call ginga aesthetic. Circumscribed by a participating audience, these nonverbal conversations articulate dynamic process of identification, where movement takes precedent over the way one looks like or the position that one occupies in society. Secondly, I'm going to examine the work of Grupo Cena 11. Over the years, this company has engaged in an unorthodox process of research, employing a variety of tools, such as a very violent, actually, dance technique called physical perception, which they perform on stage, and an innovative understanding of voodoo bodies, where dancers personify dolls, movement function as needles, and the audience becomes sensorial victims. Lastly, I examined a series of events connected to a letter issued by the leader, I missed my point. The leader of an indigenous community in Mato Grosso do Sul, the Guarani Kaiowás, regarding their land demarcation fight with agribusiness. In the letter we will send to the federal court in Brazil, October 2012, they asked the justice to overrule their eviction and secure their rights to be buried in their land, which that right was already granted in 1988, so that even when they're dead, they will continue to occupy their social historical territory. Yet, because of a number of suicides among indigenous youth in the area, the over my dead body tone of the letter was interpreted in the media as a mass suicide threat. As performative text, the letter led to a series of choreographies of protest around the world against the current situation of the Guarani Kaiowás and also other indigenous population in Brazil. Well, as dance scholar Randy Martin suggests, risk describes a process by which an apparently single action, movement, or results trigger a whole series of consequent events that bear on an entire social process. Although distinct, the Guarani Kaiowás capoeira players and dancers at Cena 11 all constitute what Martin classifies as population at risks, whose effort also craft corporeal economies where risk counts. Yet, contrary to Martin's analysis in a particular article called Art Attack, here risk counts not only as rewards, but as rhetorical strategies of persuasions. Embodying their physical body, the examples discussed here today protest against the unilateral judgment of their principles with which they orient themselves in the world. which are often classified as exotic, pathologic, or irrelevant. Each of these groups take up a distinctive issue, be that the relation of individuals to non-hegemonic aesthetic knowledges and their development in process of self-fashioning from a place of otherness, or dance as a cognitive strategy in dancers as both researchers and as objects of study. And then 3, a cosmology rooted in their land, which bear their substance, their ancestors, and their cultural legacy. Yet, in all these 3 cases, men and women have risked their own bodies to take a stand and voice their opinion, protesting against a broad range of effects derived from colonialism, race division of labor, and cultural imperialism. Hence, in all these 3 cases, both the marginalized bodies and the non-hegemonic ideas are untangled into risky business. In terms of goals and results, their risk-taking bodies gesture towards the precariousness of human lives and the strategic power of choreographed actions. At the end, what ignited these agents and fueled their risky procedures of non-cooperation is their quest for visibility and credibility of their distinct ways of thinking about and moving across the world. As dancers, perhaps some of you know what it's like to put your own body at risk for an idea or a cause. But what if the painstaking process of learning and performing this risk-taking effort, as well as the underlying idea or logic informing the movement vocabularies and syntax that they use, had the power to transform how one relates to their bodies, to other bodies, and also their environment. But I must say here that I don't want to risk calling capoeira a dance form. Instead, I want to examine these games asking the kinds of questions that a dance scholar might ask. What are these bodies doing? What kind of risk are they taking to exchange information with one another? What kind of significance or impact does a particular collection of movement, gestures, and intentions amount to? How does the environment inform and transform the actions of the bodies doing them? How have these bodies been trained, and how does this training being mastered, cultivated, or facilitated their views of the world? How do their choreographies problematize marked bodies? What kinds of connections can be traced between their daily lives and their special moment of risks in the circle? How is the body of the researcher implicated in this investigation? Yay! Epa, hey! The world that extends from the body of capoeira Angola players or angoleiros follow a distinct logic or system of body organization centered on principles such as polycentrism and polyrhythm. As players sway their bodies from side to side, they align efforts such as decentralization, dissonance, fragmentation, reversibility, inversion, high-effect juxtaposition, ephebism, coolness, and apartness, with an array of tactics such as aggression, seduction, and mockery. They also play with bodily strategies such as dissimulation and foresight. After all, can the body signify and avoid signification? Capoeira is a corporeal regime, a mean of expressive self-production, where the relation to oneself, that is, the knowledge, the care, and the mastering of oneself, is playfully built through the improvisation of call and response games. In order to find their own voices, young capoeira players first follow and try out movement pathways delineated by their master teachers and senior players. Then, after a while, they learn to change and rearrange those same paths in order to dialogue with them, creating their own choreographies of identification. Historically performed by dark men since colonial times, capoeira has always considered a black thing in Brazil. Yet, moving from efforts such as virility and aggression into trickery and seduction, for instance, players can avoid being identified as hyper-violent subjects or submissive objects. The practice of capoeira enabled us, these marginalized bodies in Brazil, to construct their own intersubjectivity, as I said, from a place of otherness. Through the improvised choreographies, these players have disrupted, furthermore, the colonial paradox constructed between blackness and masculinity, which Du Bois calls the double consciousness. But contrary to what Du Bois identified as sorrow, in the case of capoeira players, have put their own bodies at risk on the streets of urban centers to exercise embodied knowledge that, between revelry and revolt, recuperate, come invent their cultural heritage, while stirring up fixed idea about gender, race, and sexuality. Capoeira has been despised, persecuted, criminalized, regulated, and now is facing one of the biggest threats since its legalization back in 1937. Its joint cultural commodification and disembodied dissemination. Here is an ad for you. In this app, connects you to a teaching method of capoeira that goes without the interaction with other human beings. Instead of improvised dialogue between two dancers that evoke a partner's dissonance and coolness, we are left with uniform accuracy, linear precision, and mimetic monologue, outside cultural meaning and dialogue. Sorry. Here we go. Now, Cena Wanzim. Here I would like to clarify that the argument here looks not at the company's cultural product or dance performance, but rather at the risks surrounding their ongoing research about the limits of their specific dancing bodies and the social, political significance of this process. For Randy Martin, the do-yourself motto of the 1980s was a time when risk and art made happily strange bedfellows. Cena Onze emerged from that context of the 1980s, certainly influenced by risk-taking proposals of the punk movement and contact improvisation, as well as b-boy, graffiti, body piercing, video games, cyborg, and other technological advancements. For Ahmed, choreography illustrates the findings of an ongoing research project trying to figure out how to deal with crisis and how to live with it. At the same time, Cena Onze employ those same thinking bodies to test, investigate, and put those theories in practice. Dance is a process, is a learning process, a process of obtaining knowledge about other bodies, as well as mastering and caring for them. At Cena 11 headquarters, dancers must figure out how to take risks and how to move safely, but not freeze, despite the state of emergency. Dance is a critical moment, and dancers articulate tactics of survival at the bodily level. Here, a very short excerpt. I'll read the text from the translation. Choreographer and director Alejandro Amorreda. Concerned with how each body performs choreographed tasks differently. So he was born with this disease, it's a genetic disorder, and then his body just breaks. He has about 26 pins across his body. Skinner box from 2005. To cope with this condition, he has developed an extreme violent dance technique that you see being displayed now. And then he calls this physical perception. Aim to control high-risk falls and crashes. Don't try at home. The exercises strengthen bonds and eliminate the risk of injuries. Skinner box address violence in relation to discipline and conditioning. Now, this is the earlier work, Violencia or Violence. So this piece mixes, obviously, punk and pop with prosthetics and video game references. A window to display their amazing physical strength and endurance. I believe that this work performed in Germany several years ago. So the point is that bodies are matter. And the idea, the inevitable risk of being alive and in motion. This is a work that was done a couple years ago. It's basically a summary of their research in the last 10 years. Basically, the exercise, you see that all the costume and big props are disappeared. So it's this interweaving of dance, science, and technology. Always pushing the notion of risk to its limit. His current work has been much, much more simplified than this. This is already too much for what he's doing now. His latest piece has just premiered this month in Rio. The work of Cena 11 is a symbolic protest against the neoliberal commodification of dance and its primary understanding as a form of entertainment. For them, dance is a space for cognitive inquiries, a field of knowledge that investigates theories and of about moving, thinking bodies. In 2012, after 20 years of solid and acclaimed work, Cena 11 suffered a series of backlashes which pushed them to a new level of precariousness. First, the company lost their rehearsal space, and it's now its second temporary space. Then Sena 11 lost two dancers, one of which was with the company since the day one. And lastly, last month, Sena 11 sponsorship renewal with Petrobras Cultural was rejected. They now live an impasse despite their recent awards and accomplishments, without financial support to keep their dancers in the payroll to develop their research. Sena 11 may be doomed to extinction. And we now come to our last example. The Guaranis are the second largest indigenous population of Brazil, about 45,000 people. The Guarani Kaiowás living in the state of Mato Grosso do Sul have endured a dramatic situation in the past 20 years regarding the demarcation of their land. Many are confined to small areas without health assistance, security, or education, often next to freeways. And it is in this precarious context of abandonment that many of them have become day laborers, alcoholic, beggars, and madmen. And suicidal like the 17-year-old boy that one day after his wedding hanged himself from a tree and below his feet, in the soil, left written, "I don't have a place." The Guarani Kaiowá have put on a number of resisting fights to recuperate their ancestors' land and their dignity, as well as to continue to practice their ways of being in the world. But to the population at large in Brazil, their risk situation, including their death threats and fatal conflicts with the agribusiness, remained, until last year, nearly invisible. Under the slogan, "We are all Guarani Kaiowá," sympathizers joined the victims in a series of choreographed protests anchored on an ongoing resistance for human rights and land demarcation in Brazil. Besides marching on the streets and signing petitions, for instance, many added the word Guarani Kaiowá to their Facebook name, implicating their own virtual identity or avatars in the process. Through actions, these modern and globalized individuals became a community of resistance. This decentralized sprawling of event protest against the colonial construction of subjectification exercised in Brazil since colonial times, in which the evaluation of human beings as subject of unique capacity worthy of respect is tinted by a modern idea of race. They protest, furthermore, the nation's failure to address this unilateral and subjugating set of procedures with a regime of governability that abolished the race division of labor, knowledge, and subjectivity, to embrace the ecology of human conditions and the diversity of cultural experiences and systems of beliefs.
Harupi, pura gente cuera.
Nicholas Rose, do I have a microphone still? Nicholas Rose has proposed after Foucault that modernity in the West has long been credited with the invention of the self. If so, coloniality, which Walter Minongo defines as the darker side of modernity, may be credited with the invention of otherness, which opposes normal human beings and the appropriate way of acting in the world. Boaventura Santos sees this segregating division as an abyssal line dividing the social reality into two sides, where everything on the other side of the line is rendered invisible, irrelevant, and incomprehensible, thus inferior. The examples that we examine today belong to those whose choreographed actions problematize a fundamental characteristic of this abyssal way of thinking. That is, the impossibility of co-presence of the two sides of the line. While they rehearse solutions to deal with the conditions of crisis in which they live, all three examples share the recalcitrant physicality that not only refuses to comply with the bodies of those in positions of authority, but also participate in choreographed acts that protest against the precariousness and the invisibility of their conditions. Similar to the events that Foster discussed in her article, here, these acting bodies have produced a series of psychosomatic effects in their audience, from shock to disbelief to empathy and mobilization. Their choreographed discourses have also questioned the nation-state reproduction of colonial and imperial restrictions, to whom should be qualified as a normal human being, and the rights and responsibilities associated with this classification, be they in relation to gender, race, class, or ability. Agency, Susan Foster concludes, does not manifest as the production of transcendent state. Instead, the process of creating political interference calls for a perspective of responsive physicality that everywhere along the way decipher the social and then choreographs imagined alternatives. And it is within these multilateral, fragmented, and diverse alternatives that we will find renewed ways of taking care of oneself, as well as taking care of others, as well as taking care of the world in which we live. Thank you.
I would be interested in the relation of risk-taking and the notion of controlled spaces, because in these different examples, I think it has a different role of the controlledness of space, and the point actually where it kind of turns and where the body can actually be harmed. Maybe you could speak about this a little bit.
Because obviously it's very controlled. Everybody learns, a pre-rehearsed, collection of movements and gestures. And there is, if I say X, you have the option of say Y, Z, and F. But there is, a lexicon that you go on, and there is, limit to what is a risky thing. But people get hurt, for example, and then they break legs and arms and so forth, so on. People get foot in the face. And then also they have dealt with the police. On the other side, with the Guayani Kaiowás, they're really putting their body in line, but in a very, very performative way, with this sort of like face paint that's very performative. But just last week, for example, in one of those protests, there was this one guy that got shot, and he's one of the leaders of the group, and then he's just dead. So, even though it's performative, dealing with the agribusiness, no man's land in the interior of Brazil, where, people literally shoot each other. So, they're really fighting within the limits of the law and going to courts, but there is this other fight that's also happening on the ground.
Thank you so much for this paper. It was I really appreciated it very much. It was really lovely. My question is to do with I guess the wider theorization of risk. Ulrich Beck has theorized risk in relation to Western capitalist culture as being at the heart of the kind of contemporary capitalist project. You know, capitalism is speculative, it relies on risk, and risk takers are really fetishized in the contemporary system, because if they win big. So I'm wondering whether there's how risk extends from your paper, where you've shown us, I think, very risky situations for individuals in acts of protest, and these risks are continuing, I think, around the world in various little hotspots. And the countervailing risk, it's like almost risk meets risk, and whether or not there's some way of resolving that kind of crisis that you've enacted in your paper as well.
Yeah, I think there's a huge literature of people who have been dealt with the crisis. I'm primarily dealing with crisis in two levels in this paper particularly. One is really the physical, taking risk, you know, creating a dance technique that really involves risk. For example, in capoeira, people always say that your equilibrium can only be found within your loss of equilibrium. So you literally have to fall in order to gain awareness about how to move, how to construct this particular way of moving with the body. But there is also risk in the sense that Randy Martin has theorized, which has to do with the capitalism and economy. You know, it's only risk if it's actually going to amount to something else. If it's just you in the backyard of your house dropping from a tree, you know, so there is no consequence. So there is not that risk, you know, when you buy a stock. But I think also going even deeper, you know, this project is right in the beginning, is the fact that, you know, the darker side of capitalism is the race division of labor. That's, you know, you cannot think about one or the other. So, you know, it required to put somebody else's life at risk in order, you know, for the selfness to be constructed and in order for capitalism to get implemented. So, but then is the risk of others. So that's where, you know, this playfulness, you know, and then goes back into what Sousa Santos is saying about abyssal thinking. So, you know, which we live today in the abyssal thinking modernity.
Do you see a relationship to capoeira and breakdance, hip-hop?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's very controversial how this relationship came about. I'm going to share one of the versions, what I have heard from some of my masters, and it's the fact that in the 1970s, there's a lot of capoeira players who are, you know, capoeira players have been historically connected to the army in Brazil and in a love-hate relationship. But in the 1970s, there was you know, people in the Navy that were working in the United States that, you know, came through New York and so forth. So a lot of the movements, because if you really think, you know, there's many other versions. There's other version which says that, you know, capoeira players have adopted movements from breakdancing. And I obviously, we all know about what the term transculturation means. It's a two-way route. But definitely, I think, and the reason why there is connected, it's not because one influenced the other. I prefer to think that in terms of, you know, across the diaspora, there is a series of aesthetic principles that have been continue to be cultivated, never stop being cultivated, you know, from day one that people arrived in the diaspora. And it has to do with the way you organize your body. So when I talk about polycentric and polyrhythmic, this thinking about your body having more than one center and more than one rhythm, it's something that we're going to not find within Eurocentric aesthetics, which, just to cite a couple examples, ballet, gymnastics, and waltz. So we have this upward linear body, and we, you know, we cherish precision and accuracy, and then codified movements where the body is here, and not there, opposed to improvisation, which breakdancing and both capoeira also share. So I think it's the legacy, the African legacy that we carry in Brazil and in many other cultures across the Americas also carry. Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, in a longer version of this paper, I always like to remind everybody that in the 1960s, this lovely scholar from Wales, Robert Ferris Thompson, for the first person who came up, he actually wrote an article that calls The Aesthetics of Coolness, in which he listed, you know, call and response, polycentrism, multimeter, dances of derision, and then God's Child, and then Thomas de France, who was here yesterday. I haven't seen him today, but they all have worked with these ideas of those aesthetic principles. Yvonne Daniel as well. So definitely these aesthetic principles, they're coming from West Africa, different parts of the Congo, different parts also Nigeria, Yoruba land, and then they become recuperated, come invented in Brazil. So there's no this business of keeping a tradition, but rather keeping the tradition alive.